Hello everybody! Today we're going to talk about session 23, so let's go ahead and get started. I am Ra. I greet you in the love and the light of the infinite creator. We communicate now. Questioner: you were speaking yesterday of the first contact made by the Confederation, which occurred during our third major cycle. You stated that you appeared in the skies over Egypt at the same time, approximately, aid was first given to Atlantis. Can you tell me why you went to Egypt and your, shall we say, orientation of attitude and thinking when you first went to Egypt? I am Ra. At the time of which you speak, there were those who chose to worship the hawk-headed sun god, which you know as vibrational sound complex Horus. This vibrational sound complex has taken other vibrational sound complexes, the object of worship being the sun disk represented in some distortion. We were drawn to spend some time, as you would call it, scanning the peoples for a serious interest amounting to a seeking with which we might help without infringement. We found that at that time, the social complex was quite self-contradictory in its so-called religious beliefs, and, therefore, there was not an appropriate calling for our vibration. Thus, at that time, which you know of as approximately 18,000 of your years in your past, we departed without taking action. So, 18,000 years ago was when Atlantis still existed and the Confederation started working with Atlantis, and Ra honed in on Egypt. They were really interested in the concept of Horus, the hawk-headed sun god, precisely because of the representation of the sun. And they thought that that was enough of a vibrational match for their own identity, that it was interesting, but they realized that it wasn't the right time to contact Egypt yet, so they did not directly contact Egypt at the same time that other members of the Confederation were contacting Atlantis, but they visited in the skies. As we go on to 23.2, Don asks, you stated yesterday that you appeared in the skies over Egypt at that time. Were the Egyptian entities able to see you in their skies? I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: what did they see, and how did this affect their attitudes? I am Ra. They saw what you would speak of as crystal-powered, bell-shaped craft. This did not affect them due to their firm conviction that many wondrous things occurred as a normal part of a world, as you would call it, in which many, many deities had powerful control over supernatural events. So at that time, Egypt did have a very open mind about what was possible. So a crystal-powered, bell-shaped craft appearing in their skies wasn't something that created much commotion beyond other normal, quote-unquote, things that would happen throughout their regular experience. They were used to attributing the fantastical ways of the planet and the world and rare occurrences and things like that to deities, and so it really didn't do anything to disturb the Egyptians at that time to see these things in the sky. So that's why Ra did it, to see their reaction, to test, to see their reaction. It did nothing. So, 23.4, Don asks, did you have a reason for being visible to them rather than invisible? I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: can you tell me your reason for being visible to them? I am Ra. We allowed visibility because it did not make any difference. So, again, it didn't affect the Egyptians at all, and so they just showed up to see if they could affect the Egyptians, and it really didn't at that time. So, in 23.6, Don says, I see. Then at this time you did not contact them. Can you tell me the same? Answer the same questions I just asked with respect to your next attempt to contact the Egyptians. I am Ra. The next attempt was prolonged. It occurred over a period of time. The nexus or center of our efforts was a decision upon our parts that there was a sufficient calling to attempt to walk among your peoples as brothers. We laid this plan before the Council of Saturn, offering ourselves as service-oriented wanderers of the type which land directly upon the inner planes without incarnative processes. Thus we emerged, or materialized, in physical-chemical complexes representing as closely as possible our natures, This effort being to appear as brothers and spend a limited amount of time as teachers of the law of one, for there was an ever stronger interest in the sun body, and this vibrates in concordance with our particular distortions. We discovered that for each word we could utter, there were 30 impressions we gave by our very being, which confused those entities we had come to serve. After a short period, we removed ourselves from these entities and spent much time attempting to understand how best to serve those to whom we had offered ourselves in love light. The ones who were in contact with that geographical entity, which you know of as Atlantis, had conceived of the potentials for healing by use of the pyramid-shaped entities. In considering this and making adjustments for the differences in the distortion complexes of the two geographical cultures, as you would call them, we went before the council again, offering this plan to the council as an aid to the healing and the longevity of those in the area you know of as Egypt. In this way, we hoped to facilitate the learning process, as well as offering philosophy articulating the law of one. Again, the council approved. Approximately 11,000 of your years ago, we entered, by thought form, we correct this instrument. We sometimes have difficulty due to low vitality. Approximately 8500 years ago, having considered these concepts carefully, we returned, never having left in thought, to the thought form areas of your vibrational planetary complex and considered for some of your years, as you measure time, how to appropriately build these structures. The first, the Great Pyramid, was formed approximately 6,000 of your years ago. Then, in sequence, after this performing by thought of the building or architecture of the Great Pyramid, using the more, shall we say, local or earthly material, rather than thought form material to build other pyramidical structures. This continued for approximately 1,500 of your years. Meanwhile, the information concerning initiation and healing by crystal was given. The one known as Akhenaten was able to perceive this information without significant distortion, and for a time moved, shall we say, heaven and earth in order to invoke the law of one, and to order the priesthood of these structures in accordance with the distortions of initiation and true compassionate healing. This was not to be long-lasting. At this entity's physical dissolution from your third density physical plane, as we have said before, our teachings became quickly perverted, our structures returning once again to the use of the so-called royal, or those with distortions towards power. All right, so let's unpack this one. So, Ra first visited Egypt in the skies, just by hovering over in a craft, and that did nothing. Later, as there was more sun worship going on, Ra seeing themselves, at a later point, Ra talks about how in sixth density we spend a significant amount of time in the sun, performing sexual fusion, which I'm assuming is the fusion that makes the light of the sun, and their expression of this fusion is the photons of light that we see. So Ra sees themselves as a part of the sun. So worshiping the sun as a significant portion of the creator is not too distorted for them to come and appear as a representative of the sun, I suppose. So when they came, they appeared in light bodies. Ra says earlier that when they showed up in Egypt, they were just tall, slender beings with a golden body. And there is Egyptian lore of the gods being golden with hair of lapis. That's one of the big signifiers of how they describe the beings who visited them at one point. So they were not able to be subtle about how different they were. And this in and of itself caused a large amount of distortions that they were not prepared to deal with. And presumably those distortions are distortions of worship and putting them upon a pedestal and revering them to the point where there's no question about what they're saying. So essentially Ra was likely infringing upon the Egyptians' free will when they honestly thought that they wouldn't. And the Council of Saturn agreed because they asked the Council of Saturn before they came and did this. So they didn't stay long. They left very quickly after that. But they, after a few thousand years, came back to the thought realm of Earth and watched the Egyptians carefully and tried to find ways to offer teachings that, let's make the assumption, that expanded upon what they had sought to taught earlier and the distortions that came from their previous walking on the earth as physical beings. And so they decided to build a pyramid by thought. And so the pyramids were not built when Ra was actually walking on Egypt. The pyramids just appeared one day. Ra thought them into existence. And as we go on in the next few questions, we'll see that Ra did this with intention to align with the birthing of Imhotep, is the being that was born at the same time that the Great Pyramid was formed by Ra. And then through the next 1,500 years, they built the other two pyramids as well. These ones, though, they moved local rock to the place where the pyramids are, whereas the Great Pyramid was just thought into being by Ra. So they then tried through thought forms, through thought distortions, probably through channeling, to teach others how to use these pyramids in a way that helped heal the people, but they were reserved for those who had power. And then they were able to contact Akhenaten, and Akhenaten listened clearly to them and tried to remove distortions and sought to use the pyramids for their initial purposes, which was healing of all beings. But that only existed during the time when Akhenaten was in power, which wasn't very long. Akhenaten actually died at a pretty young age. And it's usually seen in Egyptian history that the time of Akhenaten was a time of great unrest and discord, and he did so many things to try to upturn the way that Egyptians were working with their religious beliefs. And then when he died, everything kind of went back to the way it was. So Akhenaten has been studied quite a bit by Egyptian historians because a lot of the traces of him were also erased and defaced and destroyed because he was seen as some level of traitor by those who were presumably once making money by religious distortions that Akhenaten was trying to alleviate. And so, yeah, I feel like that's the timeline. I feel like that's pretty much all that Ra said there. They came 18,000 years ago in the sky. 11,000 years ago, they walked among us. 8,500 years ago, they came back and started watching closely. 6,000 years ago, they built the first pyramid. By 4,500 years ago, they had built the other two pyramids. And then 3,600 years ago, they were able to contact Akhenaten. And so that's really the high points of Ra's interventions in Egypt and when they actually took direct action that had an effect on the collective of Egyptians. So in 23.7, Don asks, when you spoke of pyramid healing, I am assuming that the primary healing was for the mind. Is this correct? I am Ra. This is partially correct. The healing, if it is to be effectuated, must be a funneling without significant distortion of the instreamings through the spiritual complex into the tree of mind. There are parts of this mind which block energies flowing to the body complex. In each case, in each entity, the blockage may well differ. First, however, it is necessary to activate the sense of the spiritual channel or shuttle. Then, whether the blockage is from spiritual to mental, or from mental to physical, or whether it may simply be a random and purely physical trauma, healing may then be carried out. So essentially, the pyramids were there to sort of filter the energy of intelligent infinity that is very distorted as it comes into our planetary web before it reaches us. So if you're in the pyramid, you're getting a much purer version of that intelligent energy to work with. And it's not super simple because, as Ross says here, everyone has different blockages. We've all taken on different blockages, but this is a opportunity to clearly see those blockages and release those blockages. And then I think this part is pretty interesting and is good for some pondering too, that there are blockages that are from spiritual to mental, or from mental to physical, or purely random physical trauma. And these are the things that cause physical distortions that need the healing energy. So spiritual to mental would probably be misconceptions about the nature of the spirit, which we all have. That's why we're looking to remove those distortions, to get closer to a idea of truth so that we aren't manifesting these physical ailments by conceiving of the spirit incorrectly. From mental to physical, that's just thoughts that, again, are incongruent with the nature of our physical reality and the natural laws that exist. And then random physical trauma, purely physical trauma, that also exists as well, where you just have the random consequences of the natural laws of the physical reality without a whole lot of mental or spiritual distortions in regards to it, just physical distortions. So these are the pathways that become unlocked for the means of healing the self or healing another self. And also Ra says too, there has to be some activation of the spirit to be able to do that kind of healing, to know that that's possible, to be able to wield intelligent infinity in that way. You have to at least be aware that that's a potential. So in 23.8, Dawn asks, when you started building the pyramid at Giza using thought, were you at that time in contact with incarnate Egyptians, and did they observe this building? I am Ra. At that time, we were not in close contact with incarnate entities upon your plane. We were responding to a general calling of sufficient energy in that particular location to merit action. We sent thoughts to all who were seeking our information. The appearance of the pyramid was a matter of tremendous surprise. However, it was carefully designed to coincide with the incarnation of the one known as a great architect. This entity was later made into a deity, in part due to this occurrence. Questioner: what name did they give to this deity? I am Ra. This deity had the sound vibration complex Imhotep. So I don't really know a lot about Imhotep. That will probably be a rabbit hole I go down sometime, but I haven't yet. And that would have been 6,000 years ago. So again, a lot of our recorded history a lot of the discerned history we have about that time is flimsy at best. So I've done a lot more research into Akhenaten because 3,600 years ago is far more within the grasp of recorded history, at least. But 6,000 years ago is quite a long time, almost twice as long ago. But I'm sure there's some interesting things to see if you were to look into Imhotep. But he was given credit for the pyramid, and they made him a deity for it. And whether or not that was a distortion of Ra's, I don't know. Ra says that they timed this with the incarnation of a great architect. So they had some direct hand in this choice of the Egyptians. But in general, they were not directly contacting any of the Egyptians at that time. So it was a very big surprise for everyone to wake up and there be a giant pyramid. Can you imagine? I can't, but it happened. So, 2310. Questioner, thank you. Then as an overall success, what can you tell me about the relative success of the pyramid in any way at all? I understand that the pyramids for the purpose were basically unsuccessful in that they didn't produce the rise in consciousness that you'd hoped for, but there must have been some success. Can you tell me of that? I am Ra. We ask you to remember that we are the brothers and sisters of sorrow. When one has been rescued from that sorrow to a vision of the one Creator, then there is no concept of failure. Our difficulty lay in the honor/responsibility of correcting the distortions of the Law of One which occurred during our attempts to aid these entities. The distortions are seen as responsibilities rather than failures. The few who were inspired to seek our only reason for the attempt. Thus we would perhaps be in the position of paradox, in that as one saw an illumination, we were what you call successful, and as others became more sorrowful and confused, we were failures. These are your terms. We persist in seeking to serve. So I think this is a profound answer from Ra because I think it also applies to these books, right? And any time when they try to help, they're really focused on those who they can help. And those who become more sorrowful or more confused because of their attempts at helping, they don't consider those failures. They consider that a responsibility of trying to then help bring those people in sorrow out of their sorrow and confusion. But they're happy if their efforts bring one person out of sorrow, because essentially, collectively, humans are existing in sorrow until they can rise up and see a vision of the one creator, as Ra says. And that's really the whole point of them trying to help, is to bring us closer to harvest, closer, a higher level of awareness, a higher vantage point with which to look at our reality, so that we aren't so confused and that we see the beauty and to have gratitude for our experience. So they did help some people. They did help at least a few people. So they do see their mission as a success, and they see the fallout on the back end as a responsibility. That's why they're here. They're still here. They're still here with Earthlings. And they do say that they will be with us until all of the distortions from their teachings are gone. So I don't know if that means until every single being who has experienced this version of reality has made it to harvest, if that's what they mean. I think that's probably what they mean, is that they will be around doing what they can, trial and error, essentially, to remove the distortions that they caused within us and violating our free will with the choices that they made that they thought were going to help, but ultimately really didn't. At least definitely not on a collective scale, only on an individual scale. I'm certain that they were hoping to help on a collective scale, but that didn't happen. So, 2311, Dawn asks, "You probably can't answer this question, but I will ask it now since we are in the area that I think this occurred in. I feel somewhat of a duty of mine to ask this question because Henry Puharich will be visiting me later this month. Was this entity involved in any of these times of which you have just spoken?" I am Ra. You are quite correct in your assumption that we can speak in no way concerning the entity Henry. If you will consider this entity's distortions with regard to what you call proof, you will understand/grasp our predicament. So, yes, having recently read the Uri book, Andrea has a lot of distortions in regards to proof. And he's very, again, eager to be led by higher density beings who are telling him how it is, how reality is, and the choices that he should make. So Ra's just not going to get involved in that particular entity's distortions of mind complex, in affirming his identity or his involvement in any parts of Egypt or any of that. They're just stepping away from that one, and I honestly don't blame them. So, in 2312, Dawn says, "I had assumed before I asked the question that that would be the answer. I only asked it for his benefit, because he would have wished for me to. Can you tell me what happened to Akhenaten after his physical death?" I am Ra. This entity was then put through the series of healing and review of incarnational experience which is appropriate for third density experience. This entity had been somewhat in the distortions of power, ameliorated by the great devotion to the Law of One. This entity thus resolved to enter a series of incarnations in which it had no distortions towards power. So, Akhenaten, being the pharaoh of Egypt, had some distortions towards power. There were obviously still wars going on and battles while Akhenaten was on the throne. Akhenaten also, tried to force all of these religious changes upon his peoples, and that can definitely tread into violating free will. But because he was very devoted to the Law of One and trying to understand and live the Law of One to the best of his ability from his position of power, he didn't, polarize negatively in any significant way, but he did require some healing, and then he chose several incarnations where he had no power so that he could balance those distortions that came from his position of power in that life experience. So, 2313, Dawn says, "Thank you. Can you tell me what the average lifespan was at the time of Akhenaten for the Egyptians?" I am Ra. The average lifespan of these people was approximately 35 to 50 of your years. There was much what you would call disease of a physical complex nature. Questioner, can you tell me of the reasons for the disease? I think I already know, but I think it might be good for the book to state this at this time. I am Ra. This is, as we have mentioned before, not particularly informative with regard to the Law of One. However, the land you know of as Egypt at that time was highly barbarous in its living conditions, as you would call them. The river which you call Nile was allowed to flood and recede, thus providing the fertile grounds for the breeding of diseases which may be carried by insects. Also, the preparation of foodstuffs allowed diseases to form. Also, there was difficulty in many cases with sources of water, and water which was taken caused disease due to the organisms therein. Questioner: I was really questioning more about the basic cause of the disease rather than the mechanism of its transmission. I was going back to the root or thought which created the possibility of this disease. Could you shortly tell me if I am correct in assuming that the general reduction of thought over the long time on planet Earth with respect to an understanding of the Law of One created a condition in which this, what we call disease, could develop? Is this correct? I am Ra. This is correct and perceptive. You, as questioner, begin now to penetrate the outer teachings. The root cause of this particular society was not so much a bellicose action, although there were, shall we say, tendencies, but rather the formation of a money system and a very active trading and development of those tendencies towards greed and power. Thus, the enslaving of entities by other entities and the misapprehension of the creator within each entity. So here in 2315, I can almost hear like the choir of angels singing, like Ra rejoicing. Ah, questioner, you have penetrated the outer teachings. Finally, awesome, let's keep going from here. Because they originally respond thinking, oh, okay, well, Dawn wants to know more scientific, historical things. So, it was the Nile flooding and receding caused a lot of disease to be borne by insects, and the preparation of foodstuffs created a lot of disease, and tainted water carried a lot of disease. And Dawn's like, no, but what about, what thoughts of theirs? What collective thoughts were they experiencing that created this distortion of ill health? And Ra's like, yes, this is what we want to talk about. This is how we can help you overcome these distortions of thought that contribute to ill health. So here, Ra specifically says, the formation of a money system, very active trading and development of those tendencies towards greed and power, the enslaving of entities by other entities, and the misapprehension of the creator within each entity. So really the idea of money, as we can now know and see from a much wider perspective, the distortions caused by money and how much we give up our free will in the pursuit of money. Obviously that's a big thing, and that the negative beings who are in power right now have really refined how they wield that distorted thought form to control us. But also because money equals power, more and more beings who had money wanted more money to have more power. And one big way of doing that is enslaving people to do labor for you who you don't have to pay, and, share that wealth that they create with them. So having slaves is obviously a hugely negative distortion, but again, it's just something for a long period of time that persisted even amongst quote unquote good men, philosophers that we look up to like Aristotle and Plato, they had slaves. A named wanderer in these books, Thomas Jefferson, he had slaves. Even supposed good people who wanted to do their best, slavery was such an inherent part of society, this hierarchy of humans, that there are certain humans who are just born to be slaves. That's a huge thought form distortion, and apparently contributed a lot to the manifestation of unhealthy body complexes in those who otherwise wouldn't be accepting this hierarchy of humans, but it just became such a part of how society worked. And it's really hard to be a lone voice speaking up against these things. And it's also very hard to give up the comfort that comes from engaging in this hierarchy of humans when you're up higher in the hierarchy, right? You don't want to go down in the hierarchy. And by speaking out and causing problems for the hierarchy, that's exactly what happens. So these are the big distortions that started contributing to a shortened lifespan. And of course, again, 3,600 years ago in Egypt isn't the first time that we had the concept of money, the concept of slavery, the concept of a shortened lifespan. So it makes me wonder, Dawn didn't go back this far, but were we enslaving other humans 25,000 years ago at the end of the last cycle when we had already come to this shortened lifespan that we have now? Probably. I think we probably were. And I do think, Ra says that because so many beings have come from elsewhere and aren't a part of Earth, it's been so easy for us to create tribes and races and others, and to create this hierarchy of a supposed hierarchy, and a very arbitrary hierarchy, class system of humans, and to say, oh, well, these people here, they're only good for enslaving. They don't have the brain to do creative, expansive, philosophical thoughts. They're just here to work and be told what to do, and they're happy doing that. And so many people believe that. A lot of people still believe that that is the case, that certain people are supposed to be enslaved. Obviously, that's not the case. Obviously, we're all humans. We all have the same potential to reach their density, and especially right now, when all of us have incarnated with seniority of vibration, everybody is very, very close to reaching harvest. So there isn't like a hierarchy of spiritual awareness that can be exploited for personal gain, essentially. So these are some of the biggest stains on our society, really. Money and enslavement, right? And the misapprehension of the creator within each entity. Again, saying, oh, there's a little less creator in this race or these peoples. So I need to help them by telling them what to do so that they know how to be people. Like, no, that's not how it works. We all have free will. We all get to be people in whatever way we want to be, even if there's cultural differences, as long as ideally we aren't having these kinds of distorted thought forms in understanding and applying the law of one, as was Dawn's question. So, in 2316, Dawn says, "Thank you. Now I understand, if I am correct, that a South American contact was also made. Can you tell me of the approximately the same question I asked about your contact with respect to the attitude, or about the contact and its ramifications, and the plan for the contact, and why the people were contacted in South America?" So, rolling back to the outer teachings, as Ra calls it, because Dawn's just checking off his list here more than sometimes Dawn is very engaged with what Ra says and able to respond, and sometimes Dawn is just going down a list, because sometimes the things that Ra says either would steer him off topic or off track, or are just a little too much to integrate in the moment. But here we go, we're going to talk about South America. I am Ra. This will be the final question of this session. The entities who walked among those in your South American continent were called by a similar desire upon the part of entities therein to learn the manifestations of the sun. They worshipped this source of light and life. Thus, these entities were visited by light beings not unlike ourselves. Instructions were given, and they were more accepted and less distorted than ours. The entities themselves began to construct a series of underground and hidden cities, including pyramid structures. These pyramids were somewhat at variance from the design that we had promulgated. However, the original ideas were the same, with the addition of a desire or intention of creating places of meditation and rest, a feeling of the presence of the one Creator. These pyramids then being for all people, not only initiates and those to be healed. They left this density when it was discovered that their plans were solidly in motion and, in fact, had been recorded. During the next approximately 3,500 years, these plans became, though somewhat distorted, in a state of near completion in many aspects. Therefore, as in the case in all breakings of the quarantine, the entity who was helping the South American entities along the South American ways you call, in part, the Amazon River, went before the Council of Saturn to request a second attempt to correct in person the distortions which had occurred in their plans. This having been granted, this entity or social memory complex returned, and the entity chosen as messenger came among the peoples once more to correct the errors. Again, All was recorded, and the entity rejoined its social memory complex and left your skies. As in our experience, the teachings were, for the most part, greatly and grossly perverted to the extent in later times of actual human sacrifice rather than healing of humans. Thus, this social memory complex is also given the honor duty of remaining until those distortions are worked out of the distortion complexes of your peoples. May we ask if there are any questions of a brief nature before we close? So, the entity who visited South America came a lot like Ra. However, the South Americans were not as distorted as the Egyptians. They understood the teachings and were able to integrate the teachings in a more useful way. So the entity in South America left being pretty happy with what had happened. But then after a few thousand years, they decided that they were going to come back again to alleviate the few distortions that had occurred in their teachings. And it sounds like one being at that time was chosen to come as an emissary to talk to the South Americans, and apparently they were satisfied again, for the most part, with their mission when they came and walked a second time in South America. However, eventually these teachings were also distorted, as is the ways of our people, and eventually they started to do human sacrifice based upon the teachings of this entity who came to visit them. And Ra even says, as in our experience, the teachings were for the most part greatly and grossly perverted to the extent in later times of actual human sacrifice. So that makes me wonder if in Egypt they were doing human sacrifice as well. I think we know that human sacrifice was a thing in the religions of South America. In fact, as a part of their sun worship, I do believe that that was a big aspect of these human sacrifices. But we still have this concept of human sacrifice, and it sort of sounds like we wouldn't have this concept of human sacrifice if it wasn't for the meddling of Ra and the entity who came to South America. So that is quite a big blunder on their part. Although, of course, this was much, much later, so can't really directly blame them. Humans have free will. We can't just blame them for the mistakes that have happened. We've chosen to make these mistakes. But the sixth density social memory complex that helped South America is also doing the same things that Ra is right now, trying to help alleviate the distortions that they caused without directly engaging with humans in the physical, with thought form contact, like channeling, like dreams, like inspirational visions, these types of things to those who will hear their message with few distortions, or with a desire to alleviate distortions. Help others alleviate distortions. So in 23:17 then, Dawn says, the only question I have is there anything we can do to make the instrument more comfortable? And since you stated that she seems to be low on energy, is it possible at all to have another session later today? I am Ra. All is well with alignments. However, this instrument would benefit from rest from the trance state for the diurnal period. So, Ra saying there isn't much you can do to fine-tune the contact at this point, but you should let her rest. Don't try to make her do another session today. And 23:18, Dawn says, thank you. And Ra says, is there any other brief question? And 23:19, Dawn says, this is a dumb question, but there was a movie called Battle Beyond the Stars. I don't know if you are familiar with it or not. I guess you are. It seemed to have what you're telling us included in the script. Is this correct? Do you know anything about it? I am Ra. This particular creation of your entities had some distortions of the law of one and its scenario upon your physical plane. This is correct. I am Ra. I leave this instrument now. I leave each of you in the love and the light of the one infinite Creator. Go forth, therefore, rejoicing in the power and the peace of the one Creator. Adonai. So the last question is about a movie called Battle Beyond the Stars. This is on my list. I'm going to watch this movie soon. I wanted to try to watch it before I recorded this, but that didn't happen. I don't think that would have made much of a difference about my commentary, but apparently Battle Beyond the Stars has some of this story of entities coming to Egypt and coming to South America. That's what I'm presuming based on this question and in the context of this whole session. What I do know is Battle Beyond the Stars is based on The Magnificent Seven, which I actually did watch recently. And The Magnificent Seven is actually a Western based upon Seven Samurai, which is an Akira Kurosawa movie that is considered an incredibly great movie. So they've remade it many times. So Battle Beyond the Stars is a space remake of The Magnificent Seven, which was a Western remake of Seven Samurai. So the general concept is like a group of people trying to protect, a group of outsiders trying to protect a specific people from another specific people who are trying to war with them. But anyway, like I said, I'm going to watch it soon, but apparently it contains some of this historical information that Ra is giving us from this session. And that is the end of session 23. A little bit of a shorter session, because as they discussed, Carla was in a slightly lower state of vital energy, but we did get some interesting information about Ra's perspective from why they chose to land in Egypt and what happened and when and how and why. So thank you, Ra and Dawn, for sharing this conversation with us. And thank you to everybody listening. Of course, thank you all so much. I'm so grateful to all of you. Thank you for your kind comments. Thank you for all of your support. It really means so much to me. It really, truly does. And I love doing this, so it's really awesome to be able to do this. And I'm going to keep doing this. And next we're going to have session 24. And so for the final thing, I just want to say thank you as well to our creator for giving us this beautiful world, this beautiful third density to experience, even if it's wacky a lot of the time and incomprehensible, still objectively a beautiful thing that we get to do. And I'm very, very grateful. So I will see you all next time with session 24.